Welcome back to Understanding Human Anatomy, the Spinal Cord, Part 3. Now, the spinal cord gives rise to each of the spinal nerves. And there is essentially one spinal nerve per segment of the body in the torso. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic spinal nerves, 5 lumbar, and 5 sacral spinal nerves. Each spinal nerve comes off of the spinal cord as a root, or as several roots. And I'm drawing in here the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, like so. And you notice I drew an expanded area in, and that will be a place where we have some nerve cell bodies. And then I'm going to draw in a ventral root. And the dorsal and ventral root meet to form the spinal nerve. So let me put some labels in here. This is the dorsal root. And in diagrams we draw it like this. In reality, each spinal nerve is composed of several dorsal rootlets and several ventral rootlets. But let's keep it simple with just a single root for each nerve. The dorsal root, and what we're going to find is that in the dorsal root is only sensory information. The dorsal root is carrying sensory information to the spinal cord from the body as a whole. So the dorsal root is sensory or afferent. So all the sensory, all the afferent fibers are going to be coming in via the dorsal root. The expanded area is the dorsal root ganglion. And the dorsal root ganglion, since it's part of the dorsal root, will also be sensory. It actually is an area where the nerve cell bodies of the primary sensory neurons are located. So this is the dorsal root ganglion, and this is the dorsal root. Then on the ventral side, we have the ventral root, And the ventral root is carrying only motor axons. Or efferent axons. So the ventral root is strictly motor, and the dorsal root is completely sensory. They come together to form the spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve then is carrying both sensory and motor, both afferent and efferent information. And that spinal nerve will exit through the intervertebral foramen. Now, let me draw in the roots and nerve on the other side of the cord. So we have the dorsal root and the dorsal root ganglion. The ventral root, and where they come together to form the spinal nerve. Now, if we were to have an injury or damage to the dorsal root ganglion or the dorsal root, we would see a sensory deficit. A sensory deficit or loss of sensory information from the area served by that spinal nerve, from that segment of the body on that side of the body. Now, if there was damage to the ventral root, then we would have paralysis. Again, paralysis of the muscles supplied by this nerve or the muscles of this segment of the body. If, on the other hand, the spinal nerve is damaged, then we would have both paralysis and sensory deficit. On that side of the body, in the segment supplied by that spinal nerve. Now, in the next slide, I want to look at a longitudinal view of the spinal cord. Now, in this slide, what I want to do is look at the spinal cord in a longitudinal section. So let me just sketch let me clean up the drawing a little bit here. Now, again, the spinal cord begins at the most caudal part of the brain, the medulla oblongata, and they merge. There's not a precise landmark. They merge one into the other. And you actually have to be looking at slides of cuts through the tissue to actually see when you move from the spinal cord into the medulla proper. The spinal cord ends by coming to a point, and this point is roughly at the level of L1, L2. So that is the level L1, L2. And we'll find that there are two areas where the cord seems larger or thicker, larger in diameter. And those areas are called enlargements. One is in the cervical region of the cord, the lower cervical region, the cervical enlargement. And the cervical enlargement is there because the spinal cord needs more neurons in that area, more nerve cell bodies for innervation of the limb, innervation of the upper limb. Likewise, there's an enlargement down in the lumbar region, the lumbar enlargement, and that is for innervation of the lower limb. So we have these two enlargements that are really caused by the limbs, which are very complex, needing lots of nerve cell bodies for their innervation. So it gets thicker. Now the other thing that we need to look at is, again, going back to the fact that the spinal cord ends at L1, L2. And because it ends at L1, L2, the nerves, the spinal nerves, have to come down to exit from their original foramen. In a baby, the spinal cord goes all the way down into the sacrum, and the nerves come off, as we diagrammed earlier, and go straight out through the intervertebral foramen. But as the baby grows in height, and the cord is finished growing, so it can't grow anymore, what happens is the nerves for these lower areas come off the cord, then they have to descend and then exit. Like so. And I'm going to draw in a few. There's many more than I am drawing, but I'm just trying to give you the idea of what it looks like. Nerves originating from the spinal cord, but then coming down to whatever level they're supposed to be, and exiting. Now when you see this in a cadaver, all these nerve fibers coming down, it resembles a horse's tail. So this area has been called the cauda equina. Which is just Latin for horse's tail. And the cauda equina we have these nerves that are running down actually within the subarachnoid space. So they are bathed by cerebral spinal fluid. And when one needs to sample cerebral spinal fluid, one will introduce a needle below L1 into this area and be able to sample the cerebral spinal fluid. If you tried to put the needle in up higher, the subarachnoid space is so thin, it would be virtually impossible to keep from damaging the spinal cord. But coming in here, these individual nerves just kind of bounce out of the way of the needle, and you can do a lumbar puncture and get a sample of cerebral spinal fluid. So, in summary, spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, begins at the medulla and ends at the level of L1, L2, and it gives rise to all of the spinal nerves. Again, there are 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral. It is covered by connective tissue membranes, the dura on the outside, the arachnoid in the middle, pia right onto the surface of the spinal cord. There are spaces between these membranes, the subdural space, is a potential space. It's not open unless something fills it or oozes into it. The subarachnoid space, which is not a potential space, it's a true space, and is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And then in the spinal cord, we have an epidural space between the dura and the bone. The spinal cord itself has white matter on the outside, gray matter on the inside, and in the middle of the gray matter there is a small CSF-filled space called the central canal. The gray matter on the inside is divided into posterior horn, which is sensory, lateral horn, which is visceral motor, and anterior horn, which is somatic motor. The white matter is arranged into columns. Remember, the white matter are myelinated axons going from one area of the central nervous system to another. We have the posterior column, the lateral column, and the anterior column. Each spinal nerve begins as a series of rootlets, a series of dorsal rootlets, which are only sensory, and a series of ventral rootlets, which are only motor. Associated with the dorsal rootlets is the dorsal root ganglion, which contains the cell bodies of the primary sensory nerves of that segment. The ventral root is motor. It's carrying only motor axons out to the spinal nerve. When you get to the spinal nerve, then you have the sensory and motor axons intermingling so that a spinal nerve contains both sensory and motor axons. The spinal cord has two enlargements, a cervical enlargement and a lumbar enlargement, and these are enlargements because more neurons are needed to innervate the limbs, so the upper limb for cervical and the lower limb for lumbar. And then the nerves that originate in the lumbar and sacral region that have to descend to the foramen of exit form a structure known as the cauda equina. Thank you for your attention.